All right, so hey there everybody. I am back in the microscopy suite in the materials department at UCSB, and I'm going to show you some atoms. So this huge, like, car-sized box, and these 4 monitors, the huge cylinder behind those 4 monitors, and some more equipment that's behind that back wall, together constitute an instrument called a scanning transmission electron microscope, or STEM. And today I'm going to show you exactly how this works. So my last microscopy video was making a play button, which was kind of a joke. But today I'm going to be doing some real research. I'm going to be looking for a specific defect in a crystalline material called tin selenide. And I'm not sure that I'm going to be able to find it, but either way, I'll learn something. So this is going to be like real research happening right before your eyes on YouTube today. Now, in order to actually blast electrons all the way through a sample of material in order to image its atoms, that sample needs to be really thin. Imagine, shining a piece of light through trying to shine a light through a piece of paper. You can see some light through a piece of paper. But now, imagine trying to shine a light through a piece of plywood. It's just not going to work. So they're both the same thing. They're both cellulose, but one is a lot thicker and a lot denser. So when you're trying to make a transmission sample that you can shoot electrons all the way through, it needs to more resemble a sheet of paper, except a bunch of orders of magnitude thinner. I didn't actually film the sample preparation, but if you remember the focused ion beam from one of my previous videos, that's the machine that you use to create these unreasonably, impossibly thin samples. For reference, the sample I'm about to look at here is mounted on this tiny flake of copper, but to see it, we're going to have to zoom in. On this flake of copper, there is actually a crescent shape, and in the crescent shape there are a few metal posts. If you zoom in on one of those posts, you can see a bump on the side. That's my sample. Looking even closer, hopefully you can appreciate how this entire sample is a vanishingly thin flag of material. It's about 6 micrometers tall, 14 micrometers long, and between 50 and 100 nanometers thin at the spot where I'll be imaging. Somewhere in the range of about 150 atoms thick. And this is what we'll be shooting electrons through to cast our shadows. Even though this copper crescent is like vaguely 100,000 times larger than the dimension we care about on the sample it's holding, it's still small enough that it's a pain to work with. So to help, we've got these fancy vacuum tweezers. Basically a tiny hose that sucks up the sample like a piece of cardboard stuck to a shop vac. This is more than a little finicky, and while trying to bend around to give the camera a good view, I actually dropped it the first time. Crud. Something like this could only happen when I tried to film it. Thankfully, the sample itself was all right. It's also worth appreciating that even this tiny sample stage is itself a miniature engineering marvel. It's designed to tilt the sample in 2 directions without translating it in X, Y, or Z by more than a couple microns. It's absurdly precise. This is actually some microscope footage from a time that the holder actually broke. I swear I was not pushing on the clip any harder than I should have been. But you can see that the hinge here that broke isn't a normal ball bearing or something like that. It's actually a ruby, like literally a polished gemstone that runs in a groove. So now that the sample is mounted inside of this chuck, if you'll follow me around the corner, in here we have the actual microscope. Like all electron microscopes, the stem here is basically just a big multi-compartment vacuum chamber, which means that this thing, when I load it into the chamber, needs to be able to stop all of the air from rushing in behind it. When I put this in, it's actually going to create a seal at this O-ring, and then I'm going to have to wait for a few minutes while it pumps out the airlock before I can push it all the way into the microscope. There we go, and that was the pump start. And don't worry, if I made trying to load that sample look awfully tedious, just wait till I get to the part where I focus the microscope for an hour. Just like that. air pressure pushes it right on in. I don't even have to do anything. A transmission electron microscope is basically casting shadows with a beam of electrons. You're shooting a high energy beam of electrons all the way through a material, and you're projecting whatever gets through out onto a screen and looking at that image. Now, because it is so much easier to visualize this when you don't use electrons, I'm going to be doing a demonstration with photons. If I have a point source of light, like this flashlight with a piece of poster board with a pinhole in it, any shape that I put in front of the light casts a shadow on this screen. And critically, the shadow is actually magnified based on the relative distances between the source, object, and screen. Huge wrench. Small wrench. Big wrench. Small wrench. I need to get out more. But if you notice, the edges of this shadow are a little bit fuzzy. If we try to look at something really tiny, let's say these ball bearings are like atoms being imaged in a microscope, this method doesn't really let us see anything. One of the multiple problems here is that the pinhole isn't actually a very good point source. It's almost the same size as the features that we're trying to image. So light from one edge of the pinhole and light from the other edge of the pinhole actually cast very slightly different overlapping shadows. And in order to accurately image the atoms then, all our electrons would need to originate from a point in space that's smaller than an atom. And we can't do that. If we're slightly more clever, we can use lenses to project a sharp image, even with a less than perfect source of light. Here I've set a lens so that as light exits this pinhole, it's actually made into a nearly parallel beam. That parallel beam passes through the ball bearings and a shadow is created. And then we can take that beam and if everything is lined up just right, blow it up to project a larger shadow on the screen. Once we send it through here, it gets smaller, comes down to a point, and then way blows up and expands out here. So we have a magnified image on the screen. Remarkably sharp. Much better than I thought I'd get with this. Those are our atoms. Just imagine that instead of a flashlight with a pinhole, we have an electron gun powered by a huge high voltage power supply. And instead of glass lenses, we have really big electromagnets that bend that beam of electrons as it's passing through the microscope. Now, compared to our flashlight model, the electron gun is at the top of this system. And it's focused by a series of magnetic lenses capable of bending the electron beam onto the sample, and then through the sample, and then through more lenses that expand that image into a camera. Now, when we turn this whole shebang on, we literally just get a shadow image of the copper crescent. Pretty cool, right? Yeah, so here you can really see that the place where there is nothing, like this, you can just see bright because that's where the electrons are hitting uninhibited. This thing is the big chunk of copper that the electrons can't get through, so it looks black. And this is the sample, which is so thin that it's electron transparent. And it actually sort of looks gray because it'll let some electrons through, which is kind of the point. You can see huge bits of strain and bending in the sample as it's sort of warping around. It's really interesting. But right now, what we need to do is basically get the beam pointed at the sample and get the sample pointed at the beam. Getting the beam pointed at the sample sounds pretty straightforward, but getting the sample pointed at the beam, that's a weirder phrase. You need to remember that we're dealing with a crystal, this perfect 3D grid of atoms in space. Now, earlier I used the ball bearings to emulate a single layer of atoms, but what if I had 2 layers, or 3 layers, or 10 layers? It gets a lot harder to tilt the sample so you can look straight down a column of atoms. This is another reason that we like to keep the samples really super thin. The sample looks a lot different now. That's because we're actually focused on it, which is, the first step. The next step is to get the sample tilted so that it's actually pointed at us. The sample need not load in perfectly flat with respect to the beam. The good news is that we can use the electrons passing through the sample and making diffraction patterns to actually help us line this up. So we've got this awesome starburst pattern called a Kikuchi pattern, and we basically just want to line this up so that we're looking at the center of this starburst, which is called the zone axis. Make it look real starbursty? Not really. The sample might be a little thin for that. So I hope that explanation made sense, because I'm about to rip the rug out from underneath it. While it's possible to image atomic scale features using this very technique, where you're basically casting shadows of atoms, all of these extra fringes and patterns sometimes make it difficult to interpret what you're looking at, which is why, at some point, somebody added one extra letter. High-resolution transmission electron microscopy becoming high-resolution scanning transmission electron microscopy. Linguistically, almost the same. Physically, mechanistically, completely different things. So as soon as I push this button right here marked STEM, the microscope is going to switch modes, and all of my explanation so far, and a lot of this talk of projected shadows, is going to have to change. Alright, so now we've switched modes. Where TEM was pretty well represented by a flashlight and some lenses to create big parallel beams, STEM, or STEM, is probably best represented by a laser mounted on a gimbal. And that is to say, it's a lot more fun. So what does it mean to scan an image? Basically, instead of taking the whole image at once, you're rastering the beam back and forth, taking the image 1 pixel at a time. And in order to do that, the electron beam isn't a parallel beam that covers the entire sample, illuminating it at once. You actually focus the beam down to a point that is smaller than an atom. So that's basically what's happening here, where the gimbal is guiding this laser back and forth, rastering across our field of ping pong ball atoms. Sometimes the laser hits an atom and causes light to scatter in all directions, and sometimes the laser doesn't hit an atom, goes straight through, and runs into the backplate. So now I'm playing the part of the microscope sensor. I know where the gimbal's pointed at all times, and I can tell whether or not the beam is going through because I can look for the green dot on the piece of cardboard, but I can't actually see the sample. In reality, this is because the sample is microscopic and therefore basically invisible. But this is the exact procedure that the computer does when it's rastering the beam over the sample trying to find atoms. You can tell that I'm making a couple mistakes in counting here. Apparently my counting in my head is a little bit faster than the gimbal actually does because I keep not having enough room at the end of my rows. But as I fill this grid in, we can start to see the shape of the 16 ping pong balls that are forming our atoms. In a real microscope, what I'm doing here would be known as a bright field image. I've just inverted it. So after minutes of filling in grid spots, I now have my picture of atoms, with some scan artifacts because I can't actually count. And if you imagine this happening really fast, where the computer guides a tiny beam of electrons across a sample line by line over and over again, you can imagine that images can get formed pretty quickly. In fact, that's what these scan lines are when you're watching any image on the screen. It's going over and over and over again, continuously refreshing the image one line at a time. It's actually scanning the electron beam back and forth, line by line, to rebuild the picture. The real trick now is that the beam needs to be focused to as small a point as possible. If the beam can illuminate multiple atoms at once, then you just get a blurred out signal because you're always hitting something with the beam and always letting some of the beam through. If I were to replace this laser with the flashlight from before, you can see that no matter where the flashlight points, there's always some light getting to the detector at the back, which means that it can't really tell where the atoms are. The flashlight light is just too wide, which is why when setting up a STEM measurement, I take quite a long time here running through all of these different modes, sort of oscillating the focus of the beam and playing all sorts of tricks in order to get it focused down to a tight spot as possible. The smaller that beam gets, the better the resolution of the images that I'll be able to form. And there we go. Now when we focus, we have a nice even beam. It gets really small. Still a little bit of stig. Let's see. And go over here to STEM. And now we're scanning. It's exciting. Got to zoom out a little bit, and hopefully we will see the sample. There we go. Spin the scan around a little bit and get it flat. So while on location Brian struggles to focus and zoom in, let me tell you what this sample actually is. If you've watched my previous video about evaporating metals and making molecular beams, you may remember that our lab specializes in depositing extraordinarily thin layers of crystals, crystalline materials, in this big vacuum chamber. That means that we end up with these multi-layer sandwich kind of structures. If you slice a cross-section out of one of these stacks, then you get to see all of the layers and find out if your process worked. In this case, we started with a wafer of a semiconductor called gallium arsenide, deposited an extremely thin layer of lead selenide, and then a reasonably thick layer of tin selenide. These two layers on top are actually the weird carbon and platinum slurry that I talked about in the fib video that basically just get welded to the top of the stack to protect it while I get it ready for the microscope. So you can mostly ignore those. But this substrate, the gallium arsenide, that's the place with the highest structural quality, because we didn't make it. But that means that it's the easiest place to see atoms. So now, if we want to see atoms, all we got to do is zoom in. And look at that. Atoms. Not very focused atoms. I'm moving diff shift. Oh, wait a minute. I got a line. Shoot, I didn't retilt. Iterative. Lots of steps need to be done more than once. It's getting bigger, getting smaller, getting bigger, turn it back. Man, this is a bendy film. Piece of junk. Who made this? There we go, look at that, atoms. These are gallium and arsenic atoms, to be precise. If you're wondering how this grid of dots actually corresponds to the gallium arsenide unit cell, like the crystalline pattern, we're actually looking at it from a diagonal, like this. And then, if all the atoms were a little bit blurry, there you go. So each of these fuzzy blobs is actually two adjacent columns of atoms. One column of arsenics and one column of galliums. So if you're not convinced by looking at all of these really fuzzy little blobs, here is a much better picture. This is probably my favorite STEM picture that I've ever taken, and after a much longer exposure time, a lot of, waiting for all the drift to go away and stuff like that, and quite a bit of processing in MATLAB after the fact, you can very clearly see the double columns of atoms here. We call them dumbbells of gallium arsenide. And in the top, you'll notice that the pattern is actually different. It doesn't have the dumbbells. This is lead selenide, which forms a completely different crystal structure. And what's happening in between these two weird sort of fuzzy blobs that look like dislocations but aren't really dislocations, I think is really interesting, but unfortunately it is outside the scope of this YouTube video. So when I was filming this video, I was actually looking at tin selenide, which is a different material. And tin selenide has layers. So I passed through the gallium arsenide, the lead selenide, and now the tin selenide. Let's try to find some cool looking defects, although it appears we've lost our focus. This sample is not flat. Holy mackerel. Oop, I had it for a second. There we go. Check it out, atoms. In order to get a good picture of this, what I actually need to do is take a bunch of images and then stack them. So it's microscopy. Looking at the smallest of things has a surprising overlap with astrophotography, where you're looking at the largest of things. So right now, I'm taking a sequence, so it's going to take a whole bunch of pictures, and you can notice that the whole frame is shifting a little bit each time, so that's the drift that you need to correct for, the same way that stars in the sky move slowly, and you need to correct for that. So tin selenide is this layered structure, so you can see, once we do a little bit of the correction here, this is two layers of atoms that are glued together, and then below it is two layers of atoms that are glued together, and then below it are two layers of atoms that are glued together. So you get this sort of double layer structure going through the whole material. I'm looking for a location where that layered thing gets screwed up in a very particular way. And that's a layer. Yeah, this is not what I'm looking for. It's cool, it's atoms, but it's not what I'm looking for. We got a gap, 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 all the way across. Okay, no. Possibly another hyperdislocation. I think those must be common, which itself would be interesting. So the actual defect I'm looking for is basically a hiccup in the layered structure of the material. Because each layer of tin selenide is 2 atoms tall, and because of some weird stuff happening at the interface, we expected that it was possible to get one region of the crystal shifted with respect to the rest. And in particular, we thought this shift might only be 1 atom tall, which would actually be half of a layer, meaning that the top of one layer was bonded to the bottom of the next layer, and so on, creating this weird zipper structure at the boundary. Unfortunately, even if the sample is chock full of these, getting one lined up in a place where I can photograph it requires quite a bit of luck and quite a bit of tedium. God, it's an ugly picture. That is absolutely what I'm looking for. Ha! Okay. Unless the tilt over here is so significant that it's making this not look like what it should look like, which I guess is possible. I'm going to assume that I'm not tilted right, and I'm going to pray that I can get back to this exact same spot later. Okay, that big white dot. It's next to that big white dot. It's oh. Oh, oh, oh. Yes. Ah. I got one. Look at this. That's between 2 layers, and then it's in the middle of a layer. And then unfortunately it's right next to another defect, which actually splits it apart again. So this is like a two partial dislocations right here. It breaks it and then it fixes it. Oh, it's so cool. Oh, this will be clean down here. Neat. Can't tell, but I'm grinning. This was annoying. I think this is the first time that I've ever gone out looking for a particular defect. Like, I want to see this thing, and wasn't sure that it existed. This was like 3 hours of tedious focusing on a really old sample. This is like a more than a year old sample that came out of the fib. And it's all like warped and stuff, which means it's really difficult to focus on, and it kept losing focus continuously. But I did it. So now I get to say in a paper that this defect exists in tin selenide because I have a picture of it. That is science.